Hello everyone. The Biochemical Society and Portland Press are pleased to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of our biochemistry focused webinar series. Topics in the series include different research areas in the molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development. Each webinar will give you the opportunity to ask questions via text, and we welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in our webinar series. Please see the website for more details. I'm Dr Gavin McStay, a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University and a Biochemical Society member. I'm also a member of the Grants Committee and also on the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion panel of the Biochemical Society. I am the chair of this webinar. In this webinar, we will hear from Professor Louise Archer, the Carl Mannheim Professor of Sociology of Education at UCL. Louise's research seeks to understand educational identities and inequalities, particularly in relation to social class, gender, and race, ethnicity across primary, secondary, higher and informal learning contexts. Authoring over 100 academic publications and directing numerous large-scale national and international research studies, Louise is particularly interested in participatory approaches, working with teachers, professionals and young people in ways that can support more equitable educational policies and practices. In today's webinar, Louise will be exploring the insights from the Aspires project, a major longitudinal study of the factors shaping young people's STEM trajectories from age 10 to 22. Questions will be asked after Louise's presentation, but you can send in your questions during the talk. If you have a question, please type it in the question box as shown in the image on the screen, and we will try to answer as many times as it allows. So Louise, please, we're now ready for your presentation.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Really nice to join you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can, Louise.
Fantastic. Thank you. So it's really nice to join you and to be able to share our research on trying to understand young people's trajectories into STEM. So the background for what we're doing is that we know that inequalities in STEM participation from school up to degree level and in the informal sector and into the workforce too are really persistent. They've been around for a long time, they're difficult to change, and that these are underpinned by these enduring injustices in society, which have always been there, but which have arguably also been exacerbated since the COVID pandemic. Now, across the sector, there's been a lot of resource and a lot of effort put into trying to address this and to change it, to make participation, to increase it and make it more diverse. But arguably, change has been really slow and in some cases quite difficult to see. In some cases, we think this might be because we've got quite a fragmented STEM education ecosystem, by which I mean all the different providers and offers around don't always join up very well to create pathways for young people. Critiques have also been made that sometimes there can be what's been called a gap-gazing fetish, where there's been almost like an obsession with trying to document and show what the problems are. So there's sort of endless production of statistics showing where the gaps are, where the issues in participation are, at the expense of really doing anything systemic or meaningful about it. And when we look across all of the different initiatives that there are, arguably, the majority of them are what we call deficit-based approaches, by which it means they're based on an idea of lack, that a young person lacks knowledge or motivation or inspiration or so on. We also know that there are multiple intersecting forms of inequality, such as by social class, gender, race, disability, and so on. But arguably, we've often, particularly in the UK, had quite fragmented policies and interventions. So, for example, maybe something that just focuses on gender rather than looking intersectionally. And we would argue that particularly for practitioners, so by which we mean both teachers in schools and educators who work in out-of-school settings, there's really not been enough time and resource and support provided to address what are often really quite complex and confusing issues. So even if you look at our initial teacher education, there's very little time. It's a very packed course, very little time given to understanding these complex inequalities. So we're not really helping educators be in the best position possible to tackle these. As a result, evidence shows that across STEM education in schools and out of school settings, they're still tending to serve privileged audiences better. So this idea of the rich get richer. More recent research from the Science Education Tracker also shows quite a dispiriting picture for England, quite depressing. And it's showing that particularly among younger age students, there's a worrying trend of decline. There's declining interest in science and computing. Young people expressing less confidence in their abilities in most subjects, but including science and computing compared to previous years. Declining aspirations, so the percentage who want to learn science beyond GCSE and up to university. An increasing gender gap as well, which I think is particularly concerning given the amount of resource aimed at trying to improve girls' engagement with science and STEM in general. Still, a third of young people feeling science is not for me, only 9% really having quite strong science identities, and lower levels of self-concept in science compared with what you find in maths or English, and it being particularly low in areas like chemistry. So a slightly worrying picture. And in our research, we find time and again, these are very typical quotes from the young people that we've surveyed and researched. Young people sit there, telling us things like, science, what's the point? Or, well, I'm not going to be a scientist or a doctor or a science teacher, so why do I have to learn this? Or often, it's interesting, but not for me. So our research is really trying to understand what shapes young people's STEM trajectories from age 10 to 22. There are lots of inequalities, but we're focusing in particular on gender, class, and race and ethnicity. And our aim is to try and help more inform more equitable and effective STEM education policy and practice. And there are links throughout this presentation to our various publications. If you're interested, you're welcome to have copies of the slides and access those. So our project was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. It's been going since 2009, so over quite a long time now. And it uses mixed methods. So we survey young people at repeated interviews, and we conduct longitudinal interviews with the same children and their parents over time. And there's a link there to our main overall reports from our various stages. We've also got subject-specific reports. So far we've got chemistry, computing, engineering, and maths, which distill the findings into those particular, in relation to those particular areas. Sorry, there's not a biology one yet. Or a physics one, but we've got a lot of output. So this is a long study. It's been going for 15 years. So we've got overall 9 reports. You can see 44 academic publications and so on. And the point of this is really saying that if there's an area you're particularly interested in, maybe take a look at our website, because it's possible. We've got lots of things we focused in. So this talk will only give a small snapshot. So what we did, we surveyed young people, as you can see, and we conducted these interviews. We picked them up, first of all, at the end of primary, age 10, 11, in year 6 in England. And then we repeatedly did these surveys and interviews through up until age 22. You can see that we've surveyed over 47,000 young people to date, and we collected a lot of interviews, over 760. So we've got a nice breadth and depth of data to try and give us a sense of what shapes, what makes a difference to whether one young person goes into STEM or not. When we look across all of that data, a picture emerges that it's not just that young people lack interest in science. So a lot of our interventions are based on the idea that maybe they're just not interested enough. We just have to make it a bit more fun, a bit more engaging, and then they'll all want to do it. But this graph shows, for example, you can see in the first set of bars there, that actually the majority of young people are telling us that they learn interesting things in science in school. So this first blue bar is at age 10, 11, at end of primary, very high, over 70%, then through into early secondary, still high. The purple column is age 15, 16, year 11, when it's GCSE year in the national examinations in England. And arguably, it's quite difficult to keep anything interesting then. There's so much content to get through. But even then, nearly 60% are saying they're finding science content interesting. This greyed out bar here is just those students who've chosen to take a science subject at A level, and reassuringly, they have a high interest. They also have fairly positive views from the home and family. So this second group of bars is the percent agreeing that their parents think it's important that they learn science. And again, you can see here, reassuringly high, apart from when it's no longer compulsory, the last little bar there when it drops off. It's also not that they have terrible negative views of scientists. So again, an example item here is that there's a very high agreement with statements like scientists do valuable work. There's also very high agreement with statements such as scientists make a difference in the world. But all of these positive views aren't translating into them seeing science as something that could be for them in the future. So down the bottom here, on the right-hand side, we have the percentage who aspire to be a scientist at different ages. Now, although it looks like it varies slightly, statistically, there was no real difference between the percentage who agreed at age 10 that they wanted to be a scientist versus the percentage at age 17, 18. And this surprised us, particularly given all these really positive views of science that we were seeing, particularly among the earlier years. We kind of imagined that, you know, the world would be their oyster, or surely if they're finding it really interesting and valuing it, they'd want to be it in the future. When we also looked at who was saying they wanted to aspire to be a scientist, the profile over time becomes increasingly narrow. It increasingly becomes more male and more privileged students who are aspiring to be a scientist. So we're not interrupting any of these patterns, they're exacerbating over time. So we want to know, well, why is it? What's creating these patterns? So again, looking across all of our data, we boil it down to what we can say is the intersection of these three core elements, which we're calling identity, capital, and field. And I'll talk through what each of these are shortly and explain them, and also we'll have some case studies in a bit as well to exemplify them. But in essence, we were finding that the more a young person feels that their identity is aligned with a given STEM area, so that could be you know, in biology, for instance, or chemistry, the more in which they feel that that identity fits with that STEM area, the more they feel they have the right sort of capital or resources, and I'll talk through what we mean by that in a moment, to support progression. And the more that the field or the educational setting in question supports them to continue, the more likely they are to continue. And where there are disjunctures, where they feel their identity doesn't fit, or they're not having the right sort of capital, or the context is making it difficult for them to continue, that shapes them not continuing. So what do we mean by each of these? So the first one is science or STEM identity. So this this is really trying to encapsulate the extent to which, for example, a person may see themselves as having a STEM identity, or being a STEM person, or a physics or a chemistry person, and the extent to which they're seen and recognised by others as having that identity. So where you have a science or STEM identity, so you feel you're connected to a particular STEM disciplinary area, and you feel you're seen as good at that or that sort of person by other people, you're significantly more likely to take a STEM degree. Identity is really important because it's a mediator, and it can mediate a young person's likelihood of progressing over and above their attainment. So where we see that identity doesn't fit, it's more important even than attainment. So for example, there's I interviewed a young woman in the study called Kate, and when I asked her when she was age 18, what do you want to do next? She'd been taking physics A-level and she was really interested in physics. I like physics, but I wouldn't do it at university. It would be too difficult. It'd just be too hard. Now, Kate was the highest achieving student, I think, in our entire sample. She had A stars across the board. So it wasn't that she was no good at it, or that she couldn't have done it. She attained incredibly and highly, but it's that feeling of that disconnect between her identity, and we'll explore that a bit more in the case studies. So capital or resources was also really important for growing and sustaining a STEM identity over time. So the more capital you have, it can help your identity, which then feeds back again. But in particular, we're finding that these popular associations of STEM disciplines with ideas of cleverness and natural talent was both a key aspect of STEM identity, and could be really problematic for young people, in particular making many young people feel that it's not for them. So this was particularly the case in maths, where this idea of you've got a maths brain, or you're naturally good at maths or not, was very much implicated in many young people feeling they couldn't do it even when they attained highly. So it's very much bound up with these issues of identity. So that's identity. So the second area is what we call science or STEM capital. And really this is just a term to help capture and draw together all the science or STEM related social and cultural resources that you might have. So you can think of it, if you like an analogy, a bit like a bag. at the back that you have with all your science related stuff in it. So you'd have your dispositions, so like how you think about science, your attitudes towards it, what you know, your scientific literacy, what you do in your spare time. Do you read science books, go to science centres and websites, that sort of thing? And who you know. Are you talking about science in your everyday life with people? Are you being encouraged by people to continue with science, and so on? So the more you have of this sort of capital, science or STEM related capital, the significantly more likely you are to take STEM at A level and at degree level. So STEM capital really supports your progression. So if you have a lot of physics capital, you're much more likely to be able to continue down a physics trajectory. But it's unequally distributed. And where young people didn't have capital, it could make their progression really difficult, even if they were really, really interested in the subject. Capital is also affected by we found very uneven, very patchy and patterned forms of careers education support, whereby the young people who could have benefited most from careers support were the least likely to get it. So your science and your STEM capital, we found statistically through our survey data with statistical modelling, relates positively, significantly positively associated with taking STEM at A level and then at degree level. And there's just a link to their one of our publications there. But we also found that having a lot of science capital was not just good for STEM progression, it was good generally for young people in their lives. So we found it was also positively related to positive outcomes at age 21, 22. So for example, young people with a lot of STEM, science or STEM capital tended to report very active citizenship. They tended to have a more positive future outlook. If they were in work, they tended to have higher job satisfaction. They tended to report good health, and they also tended to report they felt that their schools had prepared them well for the future. So we feel it's a good thing for progression, but also science capital seems to be generally good for citizenship and life. So we've done identity and capital. Now the third intersecting area is what we call field. So often in this study, we were particularly looking at the educational field. Now we know already that schools and teachers make a big difference to young people's lives. But we also found that some of the really common dominant cultures and practices in STEM fields made it really hard for young people, but particularly for young people from underrepresented communities, to access and to persist in STEM. And this was tied again to these popular stereotypes around ideas of cleverness and difficulty, but these were also often quite gendered. So we had a number of young women in the study saying things like, well, my teacher told me you need a boy brain to study maths and physics. Or another one who said, you know, my teacher said, oh, it's all the Tom girls who do physics. We also found in the surveys that there is actually differential levels of support by gender and privilege. So we found that boys, for instance, were much more likely than girls to report strong encouragement from their teachers and family members to continue with STEM. We also found that among Black students, they had very high interest and very high STEM aspirations, but they had a lot less support to be able to realise these. And we'll have a case study in a bit to exemplify that. Another aspect of the STEM field was that we're finding often a chilly climate, and in the context of higher education, we're seeing not just chilly, but sometimes hostile climate for underrepresented communities who are often made to feel that they don't belong within STEM classes or STEM settings. And even where young people had extensive home capital and interest, this could be mitigated and negated by their experiences through school or higher education science. And we'll have a case study of Vanessa shortly. When we looked at young people who went against the grain, who became socially mobile through the study, for example, young people from working class backgrounds who became the first in family to go to university, or for example, girls who accessed areas that are traditionally male dominated, such as physics or computing, or physics or engineering, areas like that, we found that, depressingly perhaps, they relied more on luck to become socially mobile. In particular, what they had in their trajectories was more access to lucky access to forms of social and cultural capital that could really support a particular STEM trajectory. And we also found that lots of young women in particular were really being put off by peer sexism within their experiences of schooling or education or further education, higher education as well. So I'm going to try and bring these themes to life now through a few case studies, so you can see how these themes of identity, capital and field intersect and work in practice. So the first young person we're going to look at is Davina. Now, Davina is a white English and European young woman from quite an affluent upper middle class background. And we're going to look at how she's had this long-term identification with science from age 10 to 21, but the disciplinary orientation that she has shifts over time. And we're going to look at how that's shaped by these, particularly in her case, through the issues of identity. So when I first met Davina at age 10, she identified herself and was seen by others as being intelligent. And there's a quote there from her dad, so certainly she's intelligent. She's a very high achiever. And she did really well at school. She had high levels of science capital within her family. Points in the interviews, her and her father would talk about wearing their science t-shirts, sitting around the table, talking about science-related things they'd read in a magazine or seen on the TV. And she went to quite a science-focused school, and maybe unsurprisingly, she described herself at age 10 as very into science, and she wanted to become a scientist. At age 12 to 14, she kind of specialised her aspirations a little bit more towards zoology or ecology. And you can see here that she started to talk about how she felt there were two types of people that are into science. Either there are like geeky people, or there are people who are like me, who aren't geeky, but they have a knack for it. And she went on to explain, well, I play guitar and do rowing, and obviously the girly stuff that other normal girls do. So you can see here how she's constructing an identification with biology or biological areas of science in something that's congruent and in line with what she calls normal femininity, sort of a popular heterofemininity, which she at that point identified with. Now, when we came and talked to her again around age 15, 16, she'd shifted a bit, and she now described herself as more of kind of a physicsy person. Now here she said people who do like physics and maths, they tend to be extremely intelligent people, which again she was sort of able to align herself with. But her femininity here, her identity has shifted. Now she says, I wouldn't say I'm a particularly feminine person at all. I mean, I swear quite a lot, I swear like a sailor, I don't dress particularly feminine, and I don't have a particularly feminine voice either. So I think what's interesting here is how her interest in physics is aligning with a changing gender identity, which is now less feminine and more aligned with that sort of traditional idea of physics as very clever and as very masculine. Age 17, 18, it changes again. She now aspires to a chemistry degree and is thinking about potentially she could continue in the future onto a PhD. But her explaining of what happened to her physics aspirations, again, is drawing in these ideas of identity. So she says, you know, if someone said, do you think you're clever enough to do physics at university? I would say definitely not, most definitely not. Like, no way could I do physics at university. I mean, I guess I'm probably smart enough to get the A level, by which she means getting an A, which she does. But then I don't think that necessarily means I'm actually like that good at physics. And this theme of not being good enough at physics, even when you're attaining really highly, was really coming out particularly strongly in relation to young women. When we meet her again at age 20 to 21, she's studying for a chemistry degree at an elite university, but she's already decided she doesn't want to stay in chemistry after graduation. She wants to go into a different sector, probably into finance. And when we talk about her relationship with chemistry, she says, I'm only kind of a chemist. There are definitely moments where I think, oh my God, I'm so stupid. What kind of genius do you have to be doing this? I feel everyone else is so much smarter than me. No one else is struggling, but like I am, and I shouldn't be here. Now, the issue is not her actual attainment. She is doing well. But the issue here is this identification, and particularly for young women, this feeling that they can't live up to this imagined, we would say, male genius idea of how you show that you are good at chemistry or good at physics. And in particular, a lot of the young women were more likely to say to us, where they felt they were working really hard, that was somehow evidence they weren't a natural genius. So the idea that if you're really authentically, legitimately good at it, you don't even have to try, it just comes supernaturally. So we would say that Davina's case really shows these issues of the inequalities and identity as part of how you negotiate a a trajectory within a field or not. And in particular, it's the really pernicious ideas which have a really negative effect on many young people's trajectories of this idea of the effortless male genius, like Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory. It's particularly noticeable in areas like physics, but you could see it also in Davina's case in chemistry too. I think her case study also underlines for us how degree entry is not the end, that it's it's not just that we need to get young people into degrees, but actually we need to look at what's going on there again. And in her and many of the other young women in STEM degree areas interviews, they often talked about these microaggressions that they're experiencing from male peers. And in the surveys, we found that women were significantly more likely to experience peer sexism in STEM degrees than on non-STEM degrees. So the job is not done. We need to still look at the culture and whether it's making young women feel that this isn't for them. But Davina also has the role, I think her case shows the role of class privilege and racial privilege in supporting her ongoing successful trajectory. So we're now going to look at a different young person, and this is Danielle. So Danielle is a white working class young woman. She, like Davina, has a really strong interest in science when we first meet at age 10 and also aspired to be a scientist. She'd been inspired by a few out-of-school informal science learning activities and experiences, but none of her family had been to HE, and this relationship with this dominant idea of cleverness comes through very clearly all the way through Danielle's interviews. As she says here, all my family's not clever. None of them been to university. Through ages 12 to 16, she still aspires to be a scientist. She is put in secondary school in the bottom sets, but she works really hard and works her way up to the top sets. She takes the non-elite science route. So triple science is the elite science route in England that's most strongly related to continuing with science at degree and A-level and degree level. But she says triple science is too hard. I wouldn't have done it. I'd have failed. There'd have been no point. Although arguably, if she was a top set student, her attainment is strong enough. She would have not left it. It's very arguable as to whether she actually would. But she develops this love of physics and she wants to do physics at A level. She gets disappointed by she gets kind of B grades at GCSE in science, but she still applies and wants to do physics. But she's channeled away from it by the school. So they don't say outright you can't do it, but they do take her aside in the corridor and say, are you sure you want to do it? It's going to be really hard. And we have a situation in England where we know at A-level physics and subjects like chemistry are marked harder. There's grade severity that's been shown to objectively to be there. They're marked harder than other subjects, which means that schools are then pushed into these kind of gatekeeping practices where you tend to only let students onto subjects like chemistry and physics if they've got a very high science grade at the previous level at GCSE, whereas in other subjects, like maybe English or sociology, you can get on with lower grades. So she feels she's not seen as a physics person, and this is very much tied to her identity. So she describes how she's not really seen as a legitimate student. She says, I'm a bit of a party gal. I like makeup and hair, and I do like kind of the school side, but everyone thinks I'm really dumb, but I'm not. I seem quite dumb, I suppose, because I do all my makeup and hair, and I seem like a blonde bimbo. So Danielle has an appearance which she has, like her hair extensions, her nails. She's beautifully made up and very glamorous. But she feels that this is not seen as fitting with the idea of a hard-working science student, the idea that she's seen as a blonde bimbo. It's also not just at school she feels she's misrecognised in this way. She talks about, in the next quote, her dad turned around to her the other night and says, you're not clever enough to go to college. I went, yes, I am, shut up. Like, he doesn't know I'm clever. He thinks what everyone else thinks, that I'm not clever because I look like this, but I'll prove him wrong. And it's not even just at home and school that she feels she's not seen as clever because of the way she looks. She describes an example of she went to a careers fair and she was trying to head towards the science stand, and a woman came careering across the floor, intercepted her and said, well, you look like you'd like to do beauty, young lady. So Danielle is constantly being not recognised as a legitimate science student or academic student, and she comes to feel that this isn't for me. She does go off and take a sociology degree, which I think is a wonderful success as someone who works in sociology of education. But in terms of her long history and love of science, I'd say this is really wasted potential. She's been denied fulfilling her real interest in science. So I think Danielle's case shows us what we call the impossibility of white working class popular femininity and physics identity, this idea that she is seen as being stupid or feels stupid. And it really exemplifies what Jenkins talks about, how exclusion can work most powerfully as self-exclusion. And I think her case also shows how the field closes down options. So the reason she's dissuaded from taking physics is because of these national practices that impel schools to adopt these severe gatekeeping practices and so on. So the third and final case that I want to look at is that of Vanessa. Now, Vanessa's a young black working class young woman of African heritage, and she also has always loved science, and she has lots of home support, particularly from her dad, Robbie, who's got a science qualification from his country of origin, but for, as often happens in this country, through issues of structural racism, his qualifications aren't recognised here in the same way. And her story is showing how she finds that her love for science isn't necessarily enough to support her trajectory. So age 10, again, Vanessa has a really strong interest, like the other young women we talked about, in science and aspires to be a scientist. She has very strong home support. So as you can see there, she knows that my dad would like me to get interested in science. He buys quite a lot of science things for me, like science kits and so on. She goes to a school, an inner London school, where she feels most of the people in her class don't like science. And she talks about the noise there is when we hear it's science. It's just so horrible. They upset the teacher. I feel upset too. I don't like the way they treat our teachers. So she has quite a challenging learning environment. But she has a very strong cultural relationship and background and support for science. And she talks about how African people like science a bit more than people here, because science in Africa is where there's getting money. And she also talks about it in terms of, development and so on. So the high respect and esteem that science is held in. She continues doing science at school. She gets B grades at GCSE, and she starts A-level biology, but she soon drops it. And she, again, like Danielle, she chooses to drop it. She says, I've dropped science. It was harder than I thought. I got B's in everything, really. I don't know, I just find it difficult. Like, don't get me wrong, I loved it, but my love for it just wasn't enough to get me through. Wish my grades were a bit better and I found it easier. I just don't like how I'm feeling. Now, arguably, given that she got B's in all of her subjects, it was notable that it was only in relation to biology that she felt B was not good enough and was a signal that she wasn't good enough. So again, there's this inequity between different subjects. And we would say the status of science is that, and the ideas around it are that somehow you have to be the very best. And if you're not, then it's not for you. Her dad talks about, if they had the knowledge now, in retrospect, maybe she could have taken a BTEC route and done applied science, but there's a feeling that it's just too late. So Vanessa goes off and does a degree in a different area, in sort of criminal psychology. But her love of science has been stifled. I think her case study shows the really valuable facilitating role that Black cultural capital and habitus has played here in supporting and encouraging her trajectory. There was no lack of aspiration, no lack of family support, as many interventions often assume. Her family were hugely supporting this and valuing it. It was the role of the field in closing down Vanessa's STEM trajectory that was the crucial factor here in denying her that ongoing STEM trajectory. And also her case shows this playing out of intersectionality across race and class and gender. So to bring these ideas together, we would say that STEM trajectories, they're complex and they're challenging, and they involve these interactions of identity, capital and field, which produce these different trajectories into and away from science, but in socially patterned ways. So girls not going into physics, Black students not being able to continue, and so on. Crucially, our data show that it's not a lack of interest or motivation among young people, despite the fact many of our interventions are set up to address that lack. Informal science learning, so ISL, has a role to play, but it's one part, and that also needs to move beyond deficit models. But what we can see in all of these case studies is that often the STEM education, systems, practices, stereotypes, and so on are all pushing back against young people's progression. When we look at young people who did continue into STEM trajectories, like Davina, we can often see that these sort of wraparounds of support over time can be really important. So we've got some publications, for example, looking at young men who continued onto maths degrees and really showing that there's a lot of capital and identity at play over time, over context, repeatedly. It's not just a one-off thing that produces a successful trajectory. So because I like an analogy, I think we can think about young people's STEM trajectories a bit like the analogy of salmon swimming upstream. So the fish is the young person. So the fish has to exert a lot of effort. Young people have to exert a lot of constant effort over time to battle their way through to a STEM trajectory. And against that, we can see the system, the STEM education policies, practices and inequalities constantly pushing back against them and making progress difficult. So that's a bit like the waterway that they're trying to swim on. So this leads to the policy question of, should our interventions be focused on just trying to make the fish stronger? Or should we also be thinking about changing the waterway? And we would argue that changing the waterway is a much more sustainable and efficient way of making change, rather than constantly having to re-support all of the fish every time. So we need to think about both of these things. So how could we do that? Well, we think there's various ways that schools and out-of-school settings can try and help support young people's identity and capital, and also change the practices that are sustaining and keeping in place these inequalities in the first place. So our recommendations are that if we're doing interventions or thinking about school pedagogy, we really need to be thinking about how do we create these wraparounds of support for young people's identities and capital over time? How do we link up different offers to create these waterways, these pathways for progression that are easier to follow? How do we get them access to more of the forms of social and cultural capital that can really help them in these trajectories? And key to this is changing practice and not trying to change young people, by which we mean we need to look at the policies and the pedagogies, the teaching practices and so on that sit around it. We need to intentionally foreground equity within this, because if we don't, the default isn't neutral. The default will always be the reproduction of inequalities. And what we really find useful is particularly to support teachers and educators or people like STEM ambassadors and so on towards critical professional reflection, so they understand, they can identify and know how to address these inequalities in their own practice. I think we really need to seriously focus on challenging ideas of STEM competences based on natural talent. And we also really need to look at all the gatekeeping and STEM qualification route issues that are really hindering a lot of young people's progression, but particularly those among underrepresented groups. In higher education, we definitely need to focus on challenging peer sexism. It's fine to support individual women, but we are not focusing enough on actually getting rid and challenging all these microaggressions that all the young people in our study were telling us about, that they're experiencing from their peers. And we need to really think about how do we make more equitable experiences and more equitable retention within STEM degrees, particularly in computing, where non-completion is particularly high, much higher than in other STEM degrees. To do this, we think a social justice approach can help. So by this, we mean taking a social justice mindset to all of our policy and practice in this area. This is because it can address the root causes of non-participation in STEM. It aligns with lots of contemporary and policy funding agendas. It's a good thing to do. It supports active citizenship and equity and social justice. And it also, there's evidence showing that when you use social justice approaches, they lead to happier practitioners and happier young people with more meaningful engagement and more positive outcomes. What do I mean by this sort of approach? Well, we've worked over many years, about 7 years, with teachers in primary and secondary to develop what we call the science capital teaching approach. There's the version for primary on the left and the secondary one on the right. And these work with any curriculum. It's basically a mindset approach to help teachers understand how to better take that social justice perspective to challenge some of these issues, how to build identity and capital. We also have resources to support critical reflective practice, like this one that we call the Equity Compass, that helps orientate you towards what would it mean to be equitable in your practice. Again, it's just a scaffolding reflection tool. It helps you ask questions of what you're doing. There are versions for teachers that can help you think about your teaching, versions for funders, out-of-school educators. If you're a STEM ambassador, there's one, and also one for senior leaders and as well. If you do any work around STEM engagement informally, like STEM ambassadors, that sort of thing, we've got a free self-paced online course, which can just help you make sure that your practice is more equitable if you work with STEM ambassadors or people like that or out of school settings. And also we've got resources for maker spaces to support equitable youth practice as well. The impact of all of these, our partners tell us, is that it helps them work in a more structured way. It helps them have a scaffolding for how to think, rather than just working on common sense, what feels right or wrong. It can really deepen your practice, and in some cases where people have introduced it across their departments, it's completely changed the way they work. If you're in higher education and you want to try and help support changing peer sexism and create more male allies among students, we've got posters and leaflets that you are free to access and use. And if you're interested in more of our findings, there's lots of published analyses and links and so on. But I shall stop there, and hopefully we've got some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Hi there, Louise. Thank you so much for that really interesting talk. So we've got some time for questions now. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar box there. So we had one question already from quite early on in the talk, which related to your different science reports. And you mentioned that there wasn't a biology report available yet. Is this something that's going to become available? Is it something you're working on right now?
Not at the moment, no. It's something we would be interested in. So basically, the reason the subjects we've got reports in is who we've developed impact collaborations with. And so they're organisations who provided some match funding to enable us to produce a particular report. So not at the moment, but if any biological societies are interested, we'd be very happy to work on that.
Okay. And did you see any differences when you were compiling these reports about the differences in aspirations and some of the barriers that you were mentioning in the case studies?
Yes, I think so. One thing that struck us was that maths is a bit different to the other areas, particularly in terms of if you look at the reasons that young people say that they choose a maths degree, it's different. All the other STEM subjects, the main reason people say they choose to do it is because they're interested in it, which makes complete sense. But in maths, the primary reason given is because I'm good at it, which we think again ties to these ideas of the idea of natural cleverness or being good at it. But when we dive down further into who of the maths students were saying, because I'm good at it, it was actually the privileged students. It's like the white middle class male students who were saying that. The other students tended to say, because I'm interested in it. So there's something interesting there around which I think relates to those ideas around stereotypes around maths that we'd like to challenge. We were also struck by computing being different in terms of not very good retention at degree level, and why is the retention worse in computing, and they have lower levels of belonging and so on their courses. And we were also struck that the young women who continued into areas like physics and engineering were statistically different to other young women. They tended to be very high attainers and very, very confident and self-assured, which would make sense in terms of, why would you go into that area? You need to have those sorts of high levels of self-belief to be able to make it and persist in an area that is predominantly male dominated.
Okay. Some other questions. Let's see. So somebody's saying that not sure if this talk has left me empowered or disillusioned. Any out-of-class STEM activities partially financed by our society might need to be rethought. So it's just a comment, I guess, on the.
I would say that's a really nice comment to get, because the one thing we always say when we work with educators is that feelings of discomfort are really, really productive. If someone engages with our work and feels, oh, that's easy, there's nothing to change, everything's good here, then there's kind of no progress. So really, whenever you feel uncomfortable, think, oh, should we actually be thinking about doing that a bit differently? I'll say that's amazing. That's super productive and a really, really good sign. And we'd urge you to look at some of the resources and take your thinking further.
Another question here. Do you think there is a typical north-south divide in the UK when it comes to STEM engagement in students? Is there any evidence from that?
So good question. We did look by regions, and there are obviously differences, which I think other data sets have shown as well, between like slightly lower engagement in the northeast and higher in London and so on. But I think within that, the patterns by who those students are in terms of, let's say, you know, socioeconomic deprivation and race and gender are more important than regional per se, but often those things can map on as well.
Okay. Next question is, I guess, in response to a comment that somebody's heard. I've come across a form of positive self-exclusion from science. Poor and minority students may hear that no one makes any money in science, and these students pivot towards business management and so on. So there's an important point that most people never meet a scientist and they don't know what we do all day long. Is there any kind of evidence for from your
yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think the majority of students do meet a scientist, but I think our messaging is, so I think it's more we almost want to get people away from having to focus too much on being a scientist, because we think it's more useful to tell young people actually science is useful for everything. Like, you don't have to want to be a scientist of whatever sort, although there's still a value to understanding more about science and engineering and so on. But actually just take it to the next level, because whatever you get, you will get useful skills. You've got, you know, handling data, problem solving skills, critical thinking, all of these things will be useful for anything. Even if you want to go and be a celebrity, and a depressing number do want to go and be a celebrity or influencer, it's actually, it's useful for everything. So I think what we'd like to do is focus less on the exact careers, which the majority aren't going to get to anyway, and more say, look, this is useful for everything. You don't need to know what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. So the next question again, somebody commenting and then asking a question. So it's so frustrating to hear people giving up aspirations because they don't meet their grade goals. When I give outreach talks, I make sure to say that I got a B in my 3 science A-levels. It's disappointing, but I still went to uni and became a scientist and later a lecturer. How can we better communicate the message that you don't have to be perfect, the best to succeed?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I mean, one, we want to work with teachers to help them communicate that, but also I think we really need to change the policy and the practice structures, which make it really difficult. So if we have to get rid of grade severity, I mean, it's inequitable to mark one subject harsher than another subject anyway, and that should just change. But it also then creates these practices in schools. So schools are responding to that context. They're not being evil. But I do think, again, this idea of broadening, so a lot of our approaches that we advocate for are about broadening ways of doing and recognising being good at STEM. So in the context of maths, you don't just have to do fast maths. You don't have to be the quickest and don't have to get it all right. Working hard, taking your time, getting it wrong, trying, being resilient, and so on. Those are really good ways. We don't recognise young people as being good at maths or science in those ways. I mean, the amount of classes I've sat in where young people think it's shouting out the right answer or putting other people down is how you get recognised as being good at physics, for instance. And we need to change those ideas so that more young people can feel good at it, which then can also flow through into absolutely, of course, you should be able to continue with science with a B.
Yeah. A question about role models here. So what about the impact of role models from the same type of background as the young people who choose not to progress? Anything there?
Yeah, I think role models is quite, it's a bit more complex. So I think that, so one of our related studies was showing more impact of close peers rather than distant role models. So people are close to you in age or from your local area, people, you know, you can meet and see, were more impactful to them than people who are famous role models or people who are distant, who are trundled in. But also it's the repeatedness as well. So there are young people in our studies who met an inspiring role model and they aspired to do that area astronomy or something, whatever it was, for, you know, for some time, but it gets crowded out if you don't repeat those forms of support and provide other ways of supporting and nurturing. It's like a little seedling. If it just have a one-off burst, it can just die or get crowded out by everything else. So we really need these kind of wraparounds over time. The young people, it wasn't who was successful, didn't just have a role model. They had someone who was very important, who repeated over time, gave them support, and had support from a range of sources as well, and recognition.
Okay. Just 2 more questions at the moment. So the second to last one. Universities in particular are slow to change. How can we encourage and drive change from not policy related roles? And what are your suggestions on this idea?
Yeah, fantastic. Yes, that would be very good to get a university to share. I think I would like to see more equity support for so frontline teachers and lecturers in STEM subjects. Most people in those roles will have come through a science route and not always going to come across these ideas or have it as part of their first degree or training. So I think we need to do more support there. I think there's also a case for universities really looking at their entry criteria and saying, what do we need? Like a lot of the time it's not arbitrary, it's a way of sorting through a lot of people, but it has the, like particularly if you're at an institution that requires your 3 A's or A stars or whatever, or in engineering they often say, well, you need physics A level. You say, well, what do you actually need from physics A level? I say, well, we teach them the physics they need once they get here. It's a sort of marker of distinction. So I think really thinking about what subjects we require, whether that can be broadened, where universities do broaden entry criteria, they get more diverse students, which makes sense. So yeah, that sort of combination of pedagogical support and policy review.
Okay. And then what practical approaches can we take as educators to be more inclusive when running STEM activities with school-age children?
Great, thank you. Yes, I would say definitely have a look at the Equity Compass summaries. So if you're like in a STEM ambassador role, have a look at that one, because that will give you some questions you can ask. It'll give you a case study, ideas of what you can do. And if you have the time, there's the free self-paced online course. It's sort of a 4 to 6 hours at your own pace course. And again, that just really takes you through the ideas, and it's very practical. So it will give you ideas of what you can do in your session, and it has examples of people who do outreach, and it talks you through the things they've done well, but also where it could be a bit better and it could be more equitable and inclusive. So I'd recommend those.
Okay, and then one last question has come in. Somebody's saying, thank you very much for the talk. I wonder if the case studies looked at whether the pupils were equally as interested in all parts of the curriculum or just specific topics. And then the second part of the question is, were any neurodivergent traits considered?
Good questions, thank you. So the first bit was, did they like all areas? Most students would tell us the bits that, they'd all have areas that they liked and areas that they didn't like, which weren't all the same. Some people like organic chemistry, some people like inorganic chemistry, and so on. People who continued in areas like physics and maths tended to like the more theoretical areas more, roughly. But yeah, it would vary. But I think what also interested us was when people were deciding about a particular STEM area and their trajectory, it wasn't just decided in relation to that area. They were balancing it with all the other subjects and opportunities they had. So often, some young people were good at everything. The world was their oyster. So they're making more strategic choices, or it would be, for example, a young person really liked chemistry and they really liked biology, but their biology teacher had just gone that bit above and beyond to give them the extra encouragement, the extra out of school opportunities, really nice outreach or work experience, and that would tip the balance compared to the other areas. So all of those sorts of things made a difference. And then in relation to neurodivergent, it wasn't one of the areas that we were able to focus on, so we don't have a lot of data specifically on relation to that. But there is I think the Lightyear Foundation are doing a lot of work in that area. So.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for asking all of those questions. So it's a really interesting set of discussions, and thank you again to Louise for this really interesting presentation. If you want to continue discussing this, we can do this online by going to the Biochemical Society's accounts on X, which are at BiochemSoc or at PPP or PP Publishing. So I'll wrap up now just by saying that the Biochemical Society welcomes suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in this biochemistry focused webinar series. If you do have an idea for a webinar in 2024 or in the future, we invite you to submit a proposal for an upcoming webinar, and you can find more information about the webinars at www.biochemistry.org. All of our upcoming webinars are listed on our website as well, and if you've missed any of the 90+ webinars that we've already run as part of the series, or would like to watch them again, please visit our website or YouTube channel. The recording from today's webinar will also be available to watch in the next couple of weeks. Then also the Biochemical Society's 2026 awards are now open for nominations, featuring a wide range of recognition opportunities and streamlined nomination process. There's never been a better time to nominate an outstanding peer or colleague. The deadline for initial nominations is the 1st of November 2024. Submissions welcome by and for both members and non-members. You can go to the website to find out more. And then finally, I want to highlight that it's more important than ever to stay connected and engage with your fellow molecular bioscientists. Join the Biochemical Society's community of researchers and specialists and take advantage of key benefits, including discounted registration fees for society courses and meetings, exclusive access to a wide range of grants and bursaries, personal online access to 2 of their journals, and more. Please visit the website to find out more. So I will finish there and like to say thank you to everybody for attending and wish you the good rest of your day. Okay, bye-bye everyone.